Так, Олечка, Данко. Олечка, good day. Good evening. Good afternoon. Олечка. Угу. Олечка до нас. So, так от. Починаємо з вами, шановні наші гості, онлайн-лекторій. Добрий вечір вже. Ми раді вітати вас на нашому онлайн-лекторії «Мова, переклад, технології у глобалізаційний час». Нагадую вам про наші правила онлайн-лекторію, яких просимо дотримуватись. По-перше, будь ласка, всі учасники, які у нас відвідують онлайн-лекторії постійно, зареєструйтеся в чаті. Прізвище та ім'я мають обов'язково збігатися з наведеними в попередній вашій реєстрації, в першій. Запитання та коментарі ставимо у чаті. Сьогодні наш перший спікер Антон-Еммануїл говорить англійською та французькою, тому ви можете ставити питання англійською або французькою у чаті. Залишаємось на конференції впродовж цієї лекції. У нас ще буде другий спікер потім. Присутність фіксується організаторами впродовж цієї лекції. Тривалість однієї лекції сьогодні у нас 120 хвилин, 2 години. Це на дискусію та коментарі на двох спікерів, але, можливо, впораємося раніше. У всіх, крім лектора, повинні бути вимкнені мікрофони, щоб зайві звуки не заважали. Це я вам нагадала наші основні правила. Сьогодні у нас з вами 5-та зустріч і 5-ту лекцію на тему «Усний переклад. Вимоги сучасного європейського ринку» нам з вами прочитає пан Anton-Emmanuel Demarchi та потім приєднається Jeanette Robinson. Сьогодні ми з вами дізнаємось про типи усного перекладу, про те, як навчитися усному перекладу швидко, про вимоги до усних перекладачів, про особливості їх професійної діяльності. Також поговоримо про необхідні компетентності, аби бути конкурентноспроможним на глобальному ринку праці. Сьогодні лекція складається у нас з 2 частин. Звертаю увагу, що питання до нашого першого гостя пишемо або протягом лекції, або одразу після неї, бо потім у нас приєднається вже наступний спікер, і пан Антон, можливо, не матиме можливості відповідати. Тому, будь ласка, не соромимося, пишемо всі свої запитання у чаті. So, Anton, we can start.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, I was nodding so much, I didn't understand any of that. I was just assuming it was good things. I heard my name, I heard French and English, I heard a couple of words. I heard Segonia, that's one of the only words I know, so I think it was presenting what I was going to be talking about today, more or less.
Yes, I presented you and your lecture.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be speaking to you all this morning from Ottawa, so Canada's capital, where we are we've just passed 9 a.m. So good morning for me, good afternoon for all of you. So first and foremost, this is going to be a lecture, a presentation on interpretation, but I want it to be as interactive as you want it to be. So if you have any questions, do not hesitate to either write them in the chat. If you could write them in English, that would be great. If you write them in Ukrainian, I won't know what you're saying, unfortunately. But I'm sure that if you do want to write them in Ukrainian, then one of you will volunteer to interpret that into English as a little exercise. So yeah, if you do want to interrupt me, go ahead, raise your hand, turn your mic on. I'm more than happy to answer questions as we go. But if you do have questions that aren't immediate, for example, you can always ask them at the end or put them in the chat, and then we'll go through them towards the end of the presentation. And I heard that some of you are translation students, not only from English into either German or Ukrainian or other languages, but there are also students here who translate into French. Donc si vous voulez me poser des questions en français, n'hésitez pas, vous pouvez me les poser et je répondrai en français et puis après en anglais pour tout le monde. All right, so now I'm going to try and get the technology to work. I mean, we've been in a pandemic for 3 years now, so hopefully this functions. So let's start the presentation. There we go. Can everyone see the correct screen? Can everyone see my big presentation or the other screen. Hang on, I'm just going to try and make it function with the actual big screen presentation. There we go. I think that's functional. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to bore you with a little bit about myself. So my name's Anton-Emmanuel Demarchi. You can just call me Anton for today. It saves us a lot of time. I'm currently senior interpreter with the Government of Canada. So I interpret for Canada's federal government, because we're a federation, and more specifically for Canada's federal parliament here in Ottawa. I've been with the Government of Canada since 2014, and I've been senior interpreter since 2019. As of 3 months ago, I was also appointed interpreter in residence at the University of Ottawa. So I now am director of the Masters of Interpretation program that we offer at the University of Ottawa. And in my presentation, I'll be talking about our program, the other programs in North America, but more importantly, all the programs that exist in Europe in interpretation. I've also been teaching at the Masters itself for the past 2 years. Okay, so if I can get this to work, whoops. There we go. Okay, so as mentioned, I'll be giving just a little quick overview of interpretation, so Interpretation 101. Then I'll be talking about the various types of interpretation and more specifically simultaneous interpretation. Then I'll be talking a bit more about the skills and qualities that we look for in interpreters and that make a good interpreter. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about, like I mentioned, not finally, a fourth point, I'll be talking about the Masters of Conference Interpreting at the University of Ottawa, and then the EMCI, which is the European network of universities that offer conference interpreting programs. And then last of all, I'm going to talk about a number of exercises that you can do yourselves in your own time in order to practice interpretation, practice the foundations of interpretation. Because very often, just like all of us have 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 languages or more, we still need to be able to use those languages. Just like you're learning to translate, you have to learn how to use those languages and interpret. So I'm going to give you a couple of exercises, hopefully fun exercises that you can do to practice your interpretation, restart the foundation of interpretation, hopefully get you interested in interpretation so that one day I can count you among our colleagues, because we have had Ukrainian to English and English to Ukrainian interpretation recently. I will be mentioning this in my presentation, especially with President Zelensky, who was with us over Zoom last March, and also the Prime Minister, who was in Toronto just a few days ago. I actually had a phone call with my colleague who was interpreting that event, so she gave me all the information. So that'll come later. That'll come later. First of all, Interpretation 101. It's always important to know what interpretation is. So first of all, I'm going to ask all of you a very simple question. Who can tell me what the main differences are between translation and interpretation? Feel free to just raise your hand or turn your mic on or what have you. Any differences between translation and interpretation? And if no one raises their hands, I will give you all the answers, don't worry. But is there anyone that knows just like the basic differences between the two? Okay, then I will list the basic differences between the two in that case. So essentially, as you're probably all very much aware, translation is written translation and interpretation is the spoken word. So very often people see our domains as being the same thing, but I would say that we're cousins. I'm an interpreter. I'm not a very good translator. Sometimes we're asked to do translation at the office when there isn't a lot of interpretation work to do, and I always send my documents off for revision because I'm not trained as a translator myself. So there are a lot of skills that will, pun unintended, translate from translation to interpretation, but very often it's 2 separate streams of training that are required. So translators have the luxury of time, luxury of dictionaries and looking stuff up, and are able to really look for that perfect word and have that satisfaction of finding the perfect way of saying a sentence Unfortunately, we don't have that in interpretation. Very often, our deadline is now. So when someone speaks, we have to render in the other language what they're saying immediately. So we often have to abandon the dream of finding the perfect word and find something that's adequate, something that conveys the message. That's why in interpretation, we often talk about the message rather than the words themselves. As long as we can convey a message and get the point across to our clients, then we will have done our jobs. Now, I'm going to stop talking for about 5 minutes. I've got a video which I'd love to share with everyone, which is a good overview of what interpretation is. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing and skip to the video itself. So I'm going to mute myself, if I can find Zoom again. There we go. So I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to play the video. And if the sound or the video doesn't work, feel free to wave your arms. I can see you on the side of my screen. So I will see you again in about 5 minutes.
In 1956, during a diplomatic reception in Moscow, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev told Western Bloc ambassadors, "Мы вас похороним." His interpreter rendered that into English as, "We will bury you." This statement sent shockwaves through the Western world, heightening the tension between the Soviet Union and the US, who were in the thick of the Cold War. Some believe this incident alone set East-West relations back a decade. As it turns out, Khrushchev's remark was translated a bit too literally. Given the context, his words should have been rendered as "we will live to see you buried," meaning that communism would outlast capitalism. A less threatening comment. Though the intended meaning was eventually clarified, the initial impact of Khrushchev's apparent words put the world on a path that could have led to nuclear Armageddon. So now, given the complexities of language and cultural exchange, how does this sort of thing not happen all the time? Much of the answer lies with the skill and training of interpreters to overcome language barriers. For most of history, interpretation was mainly done consecutively, with speakers and interpreters making pauses to allow each other to speak. But after the advent of radio technology, a new simultaneous interpretation system was developed in the wake of World War II. In the simultaneous mode, interpreters instantaneously translate a speaker's words into a microphone while he speaks, without pauses. Those in the audience can choose the language in which they want to follow. On the surface, it all looks seamless, but behind the scenes, human interpreters work incessantly to ensure every idea gets across as intended, and that is no easy task. It takes about 2 years of training for already fluent bilingual professionals to expand their vocabulary and master the skills necessary to become a conference interpreter. To get used to the unnatural task of speaking while they listen, students shadow speakers and repeat their every word exactly as heard in the same language. In time, they begin to paraphrase what is said, making stylistic adjustments as they go. At some point, a second language is introduced. Practicing in this way creates new neural pathways in the interpreter's brain, and the constant effort of reformulation gradually becomes second nature. Over time, and through much hard work, the interpreter masters a vast array of tricks to keep up with speed, deal with challenging terminology, and handle a multitude of foreign accents. They may resort to acronyms to shorten long names, choose generic terms over specific, or refer to slides and other visual aids. They can even leave a term in the original language while they search for the most accurate equivalent. Interpreters are also skilled at keeping aplomb in the face of chaos. Remember, they have no control over who is going to say what, or how articulate the speaker will sound. A curveball can be thrown at any time. Also, they often perform to thousands of people, and in very intimidating settings, like the UN General Assembly. To keep their emotions in check, they carefully prepare for an assignment, building glossaries in advance, reading voraciously about the subject matter, and reviewing previous talks on the topic. Finally, interpreters work in pairs. While one colleague is busy translating incoming speeches in real time, the other gives support by locating documents, looking up words, and tracking down pertinent information. Because simultaneous interpretation requires intense concentration, every 30 minutes, the pair switches roles. Success is heavily dependent on skillful collaboration. Language is complex, and when abstract or nuanced concepts get lost in translation, the consequences may be catastrophic. As Margaret Atwood famously noted, war is what happens when language fails. Conference interpreters, of all people, are aware of that and work diligently behind the scenes to make sure it never does.
Okay, so that video makes us sound way cooler than we actually are, but I think it's a great overview, a great presentation of what we do as interpreters and how to become an interpreter. So I more than recommend that video if you want to watch it again. It's a good overview of what we do. So back to the presentation, and again, if anyone has any questions, don't hesitate to either put it in the chat or raise your hand or interrupt me. So don't hesitate at all. So this is just a written version of what we just saw. So once again, highlighting the fact that we listen to a message in a language rather than the words of the message, and then communicate the meaning in another language. Unfortunately for us, especially when someone's giving a speech, they will speak at 100,000 kilometers an hour, and the brain doesn't have the time to give every single word out. So what we learn to do when we become interpreters is we learn to paraphrase or make things more concise. And I'm going to explain these exercises to you a bit later as well, so you can do that at home or with your fellow students or your fellow colleagues. But more importantly, we speak and we listen at the same time, which, unless you're an impolite person, is very bizarre to listen and speak at the same time. So this is another exercise that we'll be going over later, because what we do is listening and speaking at the same time. But moving on, I'm going to talk about the various types of interpretation, because conference interpreting is only one of many different fields of our profession. So we have community interpreting, we have legal interpreting, and then we have conference interpreting. So first of all, we have community interpreting, which is often in healthcare or with immigration or with police authorities, where someone either over the phone or in person will informally facilitate communication between someone and someone else. So if, for example, an immigrant has just arrived in the country and they need healthcare, then that medical office or hospital will call upon community interpreters. Now, there isn't any formal training for community interpreters. Most community interpreters are self-taught, or they grew up bilingually and then just enter the field very often on a volunteer basis, because someone says, oh, you speak this language, do you mind helping us? And then they realize they like it, and then they start doing it more regularly and helping out. And it's such a great way to bridge the language gap between people who often are new to the country and who are only just starting to get their foundations. Second of all, we have legal interpreting. So this is anything that happens in courtrooms. So anything that happens in our courts here in Canada, they will call upon legal interpreters. Now, legal interpreters are slightly different to conference interpreters, because very often every single word they say can and will be held against them. So oftentimes in a bilingual setting, you'll have lawyers listening to the proceedings, but lawyers also listening to the interpretation. And so interpretation in a legal setting is much more literal in order to try and remove as much interpretation as possible, because law and lawyers are all about interpretations and finding various definitions for the same thing. So legal interpretation is a whole different creature. But there's a lot of legal interpretation in the world, be it in national courts. If, for example, you're a head of state and there's an international criminal court mandate against you, then one day you might be before there. And in those courts, there's tons of different languages spoken. The United Nations often has courts. They had one for Rwanda. They had it for Yugoslavia. They had many different courts where they bring in interpreters from various languages, and I'm sure that in the next few years, unfortunately, they will have a lot of recourse for Russian and Ukrainian interpretation in the various criminal courts. So definitely a field for the future. But now onto my field of interpretation, which is conference interpretation and more specifically simultaneous interpretation. I'm just going to turn my notes here. So there are two types of conference interpretation. The first is consecutive interpretation, and up until just after the Second World War, consecutive interpretation was everything we did as conference interpreters. So throughout history, especially when people were discovering various continents, arriving in North America, South America, oftentimes they would need to have someone to communicate, to bridge the gap, the language gap between those who had arrived and those who were already there, and who were often not too happy about the people arriving. So at least having that level of communication allowed for miscommunications to be avoided. And so throughout history, consecutive interpreters were there to bridge that language gap and try and hopefully relieve tensions between various parties. Because just like in regular life, we're much better diplomats in our own language. So nowadays, consecutive interpretation still happens. We do it from time to time at Parliament, but 99% of what we do now in conference interpreting is simultaneous interpretation. Now, the video briefly touched upon the history of simultaneous interpretation. It began during the Nuremberg trials, just after the Second World War. So IBM created this radio technology that would allow interpreters to have a headset and a microphone, a bit like what I'm wearing now. And these interpreters would then be able to interpret simultaneously. Now, the advantage of that over consecutive is that it doesn't take away time from a meeting. In consecutive interpretation, someone will give a short 2-minute presentation, but then the interpreter has to spend 2 minutes then giving that same message in the other language. So it takes 4 minutes. So it doubles the time of a meeting, whereas simultaneous interpretation allows us to listen and speak at the same time. And so the meeting can just happen as quickly as possible. So that is most of what we do. What we do on the Hill. That's most of what they do in the European Parliament, in the criminal courts as well. Very rarely do we now do consecutive interpretation in a formal national or multinational setting. Consecutive interpretation mostly happens nowadays when there isn't the equipment to do simultaneous interpretation, or if you're doing a site visit. For example, if with work, I'm traveling through the country with some members of Parliament, and we're going from one center to another center, you can't bring all the equipment with you, so we'll do consecutive interpretation because that's the best system available to us at that point. Are there any questions before I move on to what makes theoretically, what makes a good interpreter? Just kind of a quick, I don't see anything in the chat at the moment, so I will continue. Once again, don't hesitate, ask me any questions that cross your mind. So back to the presentation. So the skills and qualities of an interpreter, and this is, I'll speak to this on 2 different levels. So learning how to become an interpreter, and then post learning how to become an interpreter. So what we look for in candidates for interpretation programs, which will be the stage where many of you are, and then the skills that we look for in interpreters when we hire them as professionals, as ready professionals. So interpreters, first of all, in general, have a perfect command of their first language, and then excellent proficiency, if not perfect proficiency, in their second as well. This is most important in our Canadian context. I'm going to talk about the European context in a second, but in our Canadian context, where we have 2 official languages that have exactly the same status, most of our interpreters will be asked to work in both directions. Now, the big difference between our interpretation here in Canada and interpretation in Europe is that we have what we call 2 active languages, whereas in Europe, very often, someone may have 1 or 2 active languages, but then they'll have 1, 2, or 3 passive languages from which they'll interpret into their main language. So, for example, in the European Parliament, it's very difficult for them to find a Slovenian to Portuguese interpreter. I don't think there are many Slovenian Portuguese interpreters out there. I might be wrong. But in any case, what they do at the European Parliament is that they turn to what we call relay interpretation. That is, they'll go from Slovenian to one of the, quote, major languages, so English, French, German, Italian, and then the Portuguese interpreter will take that and then interpret that into Portuguese, so we can go from Slovenian to English and then English to Portuguese. Now, sometimes we have to go into double relay, which makes things very complicated logistically, but say there's no Portuguese to French interpreters, but there's no Slovenian to English interpreters. So they'll have to go from Slovenian to French, then French to English, and then English to Portuguese in order to get the message across. So very often, especially in the European setting, they have kind of like highways going from, if you want to go from this language to that language, you have to go through this language, this language, this language, and that language. We have that system in Canada with our Indigenous languages. So we have Indigenous Canadians that speak 150 different languages. So our service offers interpretation in 100 of those languages, where we have freelancers coming in, and very often we have to do relay interpretation from French to English and then English to that Indigenous language. We had to do relay interpretation. I'll talk about it now. We had to do relay interpretation when President Zelensky spoke before the Canadian Federal Parliament in March 2022, so over a year ago now. He gave a speech, and for that we brought in some Ukrainian to English interpreters. And so those interpreters would go from Ukrainian to English, and then our team would go from English to French. That way everyone would understand what was going on. And then if someone spoke French in the House of Commons, then we would go from French to English, and the Ukrainian interpreters would go from English to Ukrainian. Now, this is a huge digression, so I'm going to go back to my slide and talk more about President Zelensky later on. So perfect command of a first language, almost perfect command of a second, and then very, very good proficiency in a passive language. So you won't be asked to work into your passive language usually. So oftentimes you'll only be asked to understand your passive language well enough to interpret from that into your main language. Now, interpreters are, just like translators, are confronted with so many different subjects. Even in a single day, you could be translating as we could be interpreting a text about the economy, and then we're talking about foreign affairs, and then we're talking about the status of women. And so we require, in interpretation, as is the case in translation, a good, broad, general knowledge of pretty much everything. We like to explain it as just having just a little layer of knowledge about everything under the sun. And then, just like in translation, where if you're given a text that you're not particularly familiar with, you'll open documents and dictionaries and reference documents. We, before an assignment, will be told, okay, you're doing nuclear fusion today, and we think, oh boy, that's not our subject of expertise. So in that case, we will do our research before an assignment and then have glossaries ready, because during the assignment we don't have time to look many things up. It's also very important as interpreters to follow the news and current events. Most of our work, especially in the national and multinational sector, will be parliaments, governments, international courts, international organizations. So they very much are the news, or they follow the news, and they are very much involved in current events. So it's good to have that natural curiosity in news and current events. In the admissions process for the masters at the University of Ottawa, for example, we judge people not only on their language skills, but on how much they know about the news, about the world, because that natural curiosity lets us know that that person is going to be a good fit in interpretation. Because the less you have to think about what you interpret, the more you can concentrate on the actual interpretation. And then finally, we have resiliency and stress management. Now, interpreters tend to be very extroverted, very gregarious. They love speaking. I mean, I could speak for hours happily about this. So again, tell me if you have any questions. Stop me at any point. But that means that we have that desire to be with people, to be close to people. In translation, what I enjoy about translation is that if I don't want to talk to people, I can just be behind my screen. I can type, I can write, I can look stuff up, and it's amazing. But when I'm in the mood for interpretation, there's nothing better than being live on stage, sometimes in front of thousands, if not millions of people, and being the voice of someone that is trying to communicate and to make sure that they are understood in every single language. Now, that live setting in front of so many people can be stressful, but that is something that we also learn to manage when we learn interpretation. And the great thing is that it's in everyone's best interest to be as little stressed as possible. It may sound weird saying it, but the less you're stressed, the more, again, you can concentrate on the actual interpretation. So it's in everyone's best interest to work on that stress management. I'm going to give you guys, again, some exercises to do with regards to resiliency and stress management once we're done. So now, simultaneous interpretation. This is, as I said, 99% of what we do. These are a couple of examples of people I put hard at work, hopefully hard at work. Now these booths, hopefully you can see my mouse, these very temporary booths no longer exist. This is very much the 1990s technology, because as you can see, there's only a bit of glass. And so the sound from the room comes in and the sound from the interpreters go out. So most of the work we do happens in permanent booths. So booths like this, where we are behind closed doors, behind a window. We like having a view over our clients so we can see them speak, see how they speak and their body language and everything, but we're very much behind a window. Now, I mentioned body language because we don't only interpret words when we interpret. We have the advantage of being able to see the person and see how they speak and see their body language and see, are they angry, are they mad, are they sad? And that allows us to improve our interpretation, because the same sentence given by two people from two different points of view can mean two completely different things. As a basic example, in the Canadian Parliament, we currently have Justin Trudeau as the Prime Minister. So someone from his party saying, "Congratulations, Justin Trudeau," and someone from the opposition party saying, "Congratulations, Justin Trudeau," will no doubt mean two completely different things. And so if we hear that sarcasm, if we see that body language that implies that the opposition member of Parliament is against the government, then clearly we're not going to say it in a normal tone in English. We're like, "Oh, well, congratulations, Justin Trudeau." We can convey their emotions through our emotions. And that's why we're called interpreters, because we interpret not only what is being said, but the people themselves. We become the people themselves. And it's great. For those of you who love theater, who love acting, it's amazing because you get to be several, if not dozens of people in a single day. For the better or for worse, sometimes you interpret terrible things and you have to become terrible people. But that is what we do. And we put aside our opinions. We put aside who we are, and while we interpret, we become the person we're interpreting, so they are understood by as many people as possible. So yeah, so these are permanent booths. We also have temporary booths, the one on the left of the screen, and these are much better than the ones from the previous slides. You can see that it's soundproof. We're nice and safely in our little box over there. We're very happy in our box. They're never as good as permanent booths, but they're already pretty good. Okay, now on to the education side of things. So interpretation, conference interpretation, goes generally through a master's process. Community interpretation and, to some level, legal interpretation can happen more organically, more naturally, through just experience and home exercises. But for conference interpreting, most international organizations and freelance companies will ask that you have a master's in conference interpreting. So this is something that we offer at the University of Ottawa in English and in French. So our program is very much geared towards the Canadian market. If ever you do join our program, we will do what we can to keep you in Canada and to hire you at Parliament, because in the entire world, there is a huge shortage of interpreters. So there are jobs aplenty for anyone who wants to qualify and then who gets qualified in interpretation, which is great for us because it means there's always work to do. And with the advent of artificial intelligence and all that implies, we're also very much still safe for now. I'm saying this now, I might be eating my words in 5 years, but for now we're still very much safe because the first step towards automated interpretation is voice recognition, and we know that voice recognition is still really terrible as it stands, so we're still kind of safe for now. So the master's process usually happens over 2 years in most universities. What we do at the University of Ottawa is condense it into 1 year. It's a very intense year. So at the end of that year, if everything goes well, then our graduates come out with a master's in conference interpreting, and then we will throw a contract at them to try and get them to join us at Parliament. There is another program in Canada that has existed for 6 or 7 years now, and that has had amazing graduates. We regularly hire their graduates now as well. The difference between their program and ours is that ours is all in person. Theirs is a 2-year program. This is the Glendon University, so it's part of York University, Glendon School of Translation and Interpretation. But the interesting thing about their program, and again, I'd rather people come to our program, but their program is great because the first year you can do remotely. And at the end of the first year, if you don't want to proceed to the second year, you will still get a graduate certificate in interpretation. So if you want to go into community interpretation, that is exactly what you need. It's the first, in North America, formal training for people who want to do that community interpretation, medical interpretation, immigration interpretation, which is also a field where there is always work to be had. So if you do want to look that master's up, you can always do the first year in person, and then if you pass the first year and want to then move on to the second year, which grants you a master's in conference interpretation, then you are more than welcome to do so, and then that is in person the second year, but the first year can be done remotely. It is in Eastern Standard Time, so it would be 7-hour difference, but they have had people from Europe do the first year in Europe with a 5 or 6 hour difference. So it's just a question of staying up late for you guys out there in Europe and in Eastern Europe as well. What also exists closer to home is the European Masters in Conference Interpreting, which is a great structure that they have had for, I think, about 20 years now, where they've standardized interpretation programs throughout Europe. So as you can see, there's a list of all of these universities, and I'll be giving, I'll be sending a copy of all these resources to Katerina after this. That way you can see the list of universities. But there's also the EMCI website. So if you type in EMCI interpreting in Google or Bing or whatever, probably Google, then you can see this list of interpretation universities. There are a number of universities outside this list that are just as good. They're just not part of this European network of conference interpretation programs, which is really the gold standard in Europe for interpretation. Now, before we move on to some fun exercises for everyone, just a little bit more about our service. So the people I work for here at the Government of Canada. So we work for the federal government, Canada being a federation with provinces, territories up north, and then the federal government. So we have 2 teams of interpreters. We have the parliamentary interpretation team. So we do official language interpretation for the House of Commons, for the Federal Senate, for committees, press conferences. And I realized I probably should have put a picture of President Zelensky instead of President Macron down here. It would have been better for this presentation. But we have world leaders that come to us and come give presentations, press conferences. They have meetings with the Canadian Cabinet of Ministers behind closed doors, and we're the service that provides interpretation for that. So as I mentioned earlier, we had President Zelensky appear before Parliament. And if you Google, it's a terrible picture, but if you Google it, if you Google President Zelensky, House of Commons interpretation, there's a little article that the interpretation service published, and there's a picture of me. I didn't know they were taking my picture. I'm looking down. I'm like this. I look terrible, but you can see me in action. Just a picture with President Zelensky on the screen, and you can also see the 2 freelance Ukrainian interpreters who were the ones interpreting from Ukraine to English. And as I said, we relayed from English into French. Now, the Prime Minister of Ukraine was actually in Toronto yesterday, just yesterday. And so I had a phone call with my colleague. We sent a team down to Toronto, and they interpreted the Prime Minister of Ukraine, again with Ukrainian interpreters present. So that was another great exercise for us, because we don't very often do relay interpretation. And apparently it went great. Diplomatic relations between Canada and Ukraine are still great. So I think we did a good job, because as you saw in the video, sometimes misinterpreting something can have catastrophic results. Just like the difference between "we will bury you," which is very violent and very aggressive, and "we will live to see you buried," just that little difference can make the difference between diplomacy collapsing and diplomacy continuing. So thankfully, we train people for that. We train people to understand what the context is and how to interpret things for different clients as well. Because oftentimes different people use different terminology. So I'm French. I learned French in France. I learned English in the UK. And very often I can't use my home terminology in North America. But what happens when you're interpreting for people both from North America and Europe? Do you use North American terminology? Do you use European terminology? Do you use both? Or say, this is what this is, and this is the term I'll be using for today? These are all questions we have to ask ourselves, sometimes in a split-second decision. Do I say cell phone? Do I say mobile phone? Do I say highway? Do I say motorway? What do I do in these circumstances? This is all stuff that we have to think about, and that you have to think about as well in translation when you're working for a specific client. Does this client have their own terminology, especially in technical translation? Do they have their own glossary? Should I ask them to send me their glossary? Should I ask them questions? Clients, I found in interpretation, are always very happy to talk to us with more information. So I hope it's the same in translation. Your clients love being asked, is this the right term? Is that the right term? Because it lets them know that you're really putting a lot of effort and a lot of love into that work. Now I see it is 9:40, so I'm going to switch to the next. 9:40 for me, 4:40 for Ukraine. So our second interpretation service is anything that happens outside of a parliamentary setting. So we work for the federal departments and agencies, so Health Canada, National Defence, Intelligence, the Space Agency. We had a colleague a few years ago break our record for the longest distance interpretation. She was interpreting Chris Hadfield back in the day, who was on the International Space Station. So she still holds the record for the longest distance interpretation in our service. So that's our second interpretation team. But more importantly, let's talk about exercises that you can do to see, one, if you like interpretation, two, if this is something that could be of interest to you in the future. So these are 4 exercises that I would recommend for everyone just to try interpretation. I'm going to explain all 4 of them for you. So first of all, we have shadowing. Now, shadowing really is the basics of interpretation. Like the video was saying, it is very bizarre. Listening and speaking at the same time, it's not natural. We're all polite people. We don't speak when other people are speaking. But in interpretation, you get paid to speak when other people are speaking. So we have to learn how to do that well. So the exercise I recommend for all of you foreshadowing is to find, say, a news report or just a podcast or something in the language of your choice. So English or Ukrainian or Français if you want to as well, auf Deutsch if you want, Italiano, whatever. So something that you can then listen to and repeat in the same language. So all you're doing is listening to what is being said and then speaking at the same time. And when you do it the first couple of times, it's going to be weird. The first time I did it, I physically couldn't listen and speak at the same time. It was very bizarre because I could hear my own voice. I got into my own head. So my recommendation is, especially if you have a podcast, you can put the podcast at half speed, 3/4 speed, 1x speed, and then just repeat what the person is saying as they're saying it. And then as you get better and better and better at that, you can start implementing what we call lag, which very simply is just waiting 1 second or 2 before you start talking. So the person starts talking and you wait 1 second and then you start talking. And you get into the rhythm of listening and buffering that information in your mind and then giving it out a couple of seconds later, because that is really the very basics of interpretation. Having that capacity to listen and to speak at the same time. And shadowing is something that we look for in our candidates as something that has a great potential for interpretation. Now, the second exercise is paraphrasing and reformulation, because we have to do a lot of it. Unfortunately, as I was saying earlier in the presentation, we have to abandon all hopes and dreams of giving a perfect rendering of what is being said. So we have to paraphrase, we have to reformulate, we have to make things shorter and more concise. So the exercise I recommend for this is finding a news article. Now, news articles are good at condensing information already. And first of all, read how they condense information and read that article and see how they paraphrase and condense information. And then go to a speech. Now, political speeches are filled with useless information. a lot of speaking for very little information. And that is a perfect exercise for you to read, say, 1 or 2 sentences, and then find a different way of saying that sentence. And then a second way of saying that sentence, a third way of saying that sentence, or a way of saying that sentence much more concisely. And political speeches are really good for that because they allow you to cut out all of the useless stuff and give the same amount of information in far fewer words. And that is a lot of what we focus on in the first couple of months of the master's process when we teach interpretation, is that capacity to look at a sentence and say, there's a much better way of saying the sentence, and we're going to condense it. So that's another exercise you can do with, first of all, reading and looking at news articles that are nice and condensed, and then working with speeches, especially political speeches, to paraphrase, so finding different ways of saying it, reformulating, and then making it more concise. And the more you do it, the more it's going to become natural, and the more you can focus on the other parts of interpretation. So basic consecutive is also great. Now, when I say basic consecutive, I mean nothing technical. So someone talking about their day, someone saying, oh, well, today I did X, Y, Z, just one sentence at a time. You can do this with your friends, with your families, with your loved ones, with your colleagues, with your fellow students. If you want to have fun after a class, just get together, and someone will just, at the beginning, just one sentence at a time, say, hi, my name is XYZ, and today I would like to talk to you about my life. And then the other person in the other language will then just give that one sentence. And then as you get better, you can do 2 sentences, sometimes maybe a paragraph. And that is also a great exercise for you to condense and reformulate information as it's happening. So as someone is talking to you. So the first stage is paraphrasing, reformulating a text. And then you move on to that consecutive, which allows you to implement what you've learned before someone's speaking to you in a live setting. And then last of all, public speaking, which is also very useful for your temperament, resiliency, and stress. It is always great to be able to speak in front of sometimes thousands of people without getting stressed about it. Because again, stress will often have an effect on your interpretation. So public speaking, even if it's in front of your class, even if it's today asking a question, raising your hand, turning that mic on, that is a great first step towards that public speaking, wanting to speak to people, especially people that you've never met in your life, like myself. None of you have met me before, so it's a great opportunity to raise your hand and ask some questions, and that is a transition to my last point, which is, does anyone have any questions? Because I think I've spoken for far too long, so I'm going to go back to my Zoom screen. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go back to my Zoom screen. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? Anything about either myself, the profession, my presentation? You can also tell me to stop talking and go away. That's another option. So yep, feel free. If anyone has any questions, then now is the time. All right, excellent question in the chat from Larissa. Aren't you afraid that artificial intelligence will replace a human interpreter? Now, the answer to that is eventually. Yes, eventually we will probably get replaced by AI, but this is very much not a risk to us right now, and I'm going to explain to you why. There are several steps that have to be overcome with artificial intelligence before we can be replaced by robots. So the first one I've already mentioned is speech recognition. Now, if you go on YouTube and you watch a video and you turn on automatic closed captioning, they're not very good. And we're talking about Google, one of the biggest companies that are pushing artificial intelligence to its maximum. So until speech recognition and voice recognition is perfect, we won't be replaced. And the second someone has any accent that deviates from the norm, if someone speaks in a muffled way, if someone doesn't have a good microphone and they can't be heard, voice recognition is still light years away from understanding people perfectly enough. So the second point after that is the actual language transferal from, I'm going to use the Canadian example, from English to French. So far, only the human mind can, in a live setting, immediately get a language, deconstruct it into units of meaning, and then reconstruct it idiomatically in the second language. Now, artificial intelligence has made huge progression over the past couple of years in understanding languages, but they still haven't gotten to that stage where they can do it on the fly. They can do it immediately, as fast as we can with our human brains. And as I was saying earlier, artificial intelligence is very poor at understanding the nuance between a sentence said normally and a sentence said sarcastically. They can't pick up on vocal emotions like the human brain can. They can't look at someone and say, oh, they're waving their arms about, so this is how they're conveying the message. I need to increase my own tone and make it a bit more excited or angry than I would if they were just speaking like this, like they were reading a speech. And so the human brain is the only thing that can immediately listen to the message, see the person, listen to those emotions while interpreting, and then convey that message immediately. And then the last point is the actual voices at the end. Like, we do have realistic voices, and there have been tests done for people just for the enjoyment of listening. Like, would you rather listen to a human voice for 3 hours straight or a robotic voice for 3 hours straight? Now, there are very natural robotic voices nowadays, but they're still not quite in a place where people enjoy listening to them for 3 hours straight. So all of those hurdles need to be overcome before we are even close to replacing the human brain as an interpreter. And even that first hurdle of voice recognition is still light years away from being reached. So maybe one day we will be replaced, but am I afraid that artificial intelligence will replace a human interpreter? No, I'm not. Not for now. I might be eating my words in 5 years, but for now, we're very much safe, because there are still far too many hurdles to overcome before there's anything close to the quality of interpretation you can get from the human mind. So that was a great question. Thank you for asking that. Are there any other questions?
Anton, yes, I have a question.
All right, go ahead.
So, tell me, please, how do you think, can we say that interpreter is the profession of the future, or not? What do you think about it?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to start by flipping that over by saying that interpretation has always been the profession of the past. Throughout history, interpreters have been required to bridge the gap, like I've said many times in the presentation. I love that expression, to bridge the gap between cultures and languages, and even between cultures. An interpreter who is culturally fluent in one culture's practice and the other culture's practice can also convey the information that you should probably not be doing this right now. This culture will find this insulting, this culture won't find it insulting. So in the past, interpreters have been essential in the world of diplomacy, in the world of communication. And so it's been a profession of the past, it's a profession right now, and in the future there will always be the need for communication. Esperanto exists. It's existed for over 100 years now, but we're still not all speaking the same language, because we all love our own language and we can all communicate best in our original language. So it's better to be able to speak in your own language and then have your perfect mother tongue then be interpreted into a perfect version of the target mother tongue. And so in the future, people will still want to turn towards someone who can convey that message in the other language. Now, we're still very much a job of the future because of what I mentioned about how we're protected against the tidal wave of artificial intelligence. But also, I had a third point, which I have now forgotten. So let me just think about a couple of seconds. I had a third point, and then I saw artificial intelligence, and I was like, this is another point I want to make. So the point of the future, there's my third point. I mentioned this in the presentation, but there is always a huge shortage of interpreters. Interpreters, just like translators, don't just exist. Don't just wake up one morning and say, hey, I'm a translator. As you all know, you can have two languages, but you need to learn how to use them. The analogy I love using in this case is that we all have two hands. Well, most of us have two hands. I hope you all have two hands. But you still need to learn how to use them to play the piano effectively. Just like our interpretation students have English and French, they have those two languages, but they still have to learn how to use them to become interpreters. Yes, I can go to a piano and go and start banging on the keys and make noise, but I would still need to learn how to use my hands to play the piano well. So that is the case as well as in interpretation. And so given that you can't just wake up one morning and become a translator, wake up one morning and become an interpreter, it means that people have to be trained, and not a lot of people know we exist, and even fewer people want to become interpreters. So that's why I'm so happy to be here today and hopefully plant the seed of interpretation in as many minds as possible, because there is always that need for interpreters throughout the world, not only in North America, but in Europe and elsewhere in the world. There's always that need for communication. People will always talk to one another. People will always have to communicate. And so we always need those communicators out there, those who will once again bridge the gap between the various languages and various cultures. So in one sentence, yes, very much a job of the future.
Okay, Anton, and I have one more question.
Yep, I'm here for it.
We talk that we have many types of interpreting. Yes?
Yep.
And tell me, please, when you work with your student, when you train them, you work with them with different types of interpreting, or maybe you have just one something course, unique maybe interpreting, or it is work with different types of interpreting?
So that is an excellent question, and something that I'm going to put in my presentation for the next time I give this kind of presentation, because it's very true. So we teach the various types of interpretation in our program. So for example, at the University of Ottawa, we will teach consecutive and simultaneous interpretation. In Europe, very often, they have an entire year of consecutive interpretation, after which they'll do simultaneous. So they won't touch simultaneous interpretation before an entire year of consecutive interpretation. So for example, in our program, the first semester, so September to December, will very much focus on paraphrasing, reformulating, getting that interpreter's mind and that analytical mind prepped, that foundation upon which we'll then build the capacity to interpret. And then we start with consecutive interpretation, which allows you to start activating your interpretation skills, but not in a 100% live setting. So you have the message coming at you, and then you have time to think about it and then render it in the other language. So we teach consecutive and then some simultaneous interpretation in the first semester, and then in the second semester, and then the third semester, so the spring and then the summer semesters, then we'll do nearly all simultaneous interpretation. That way our graduates know how to do consecutive and simultaneous, because even if we do, in the 8 years I've been with, nearly 9 years I've been with the Translation Bureau with the Government of Canada, I've done consecutive interpretation 3 times, but it's still a skill that we have to learn, because in Europe there's a lot more consecutive interpretation than in North America. We're much bigger on the simultaneous interpretation here in North America. So we do teach both consecutive and simultaneous. But yeah, European programs tend to heavily focus, sometimes for an entire year, on consecutive interpretation, because that's a great basis, a great springboard then towards simultaneous interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And we have one question in our chat. So does the knowledge of English help while translating to from French? As I know, there are a lot of similar words which are actually false friends. Are there any dictionaries that can help to learn such words? I mean, false friends. Thank you.
So that's a question that is exactly on the nose for interpretation, because that false friend is actually an exercise that we have in our admissions process. When we test people's language skills, we also test them to see if they know, if they really have an in-depth knowledge of both languages. And there are so many false friends between English and French, because they, as we all know, they come from the same roots. And so they're very often words that sound the same, but that develop differently in both languages. So knowledge of English does 100% help with translating and interpreting to and from French, and vice versa. In other languages, they're completely different languages, so there's not that big a risk. But for example, the French actuellement, which means right now, is not actually in English. Compréhensif, comprehensive. So many ignorer in French and to ignore in English. To ignore is to not want to have anything to do with something, but ignorer is to not know something. Éventuellement in French means in the eventuality, like if the certain conditions are met, then something will happen. In English, eventually it's inevitable, it's going to happen. And so these kind of false friends are very dangerous. unfortunately, especially especially here in a lot of meetings, people will use, seeing as though so many people are bilingual, sometimes they don't have that barrier between false friends. So we'll have a francophone talking about une facilité for a facility, but a facility and facilité don't even have anything to do with one another. So as interpreters, we have to figure out, are they saying facilité in French, or are they then calquing that English facility, which is installation in French? And so we have to figure out what that is. And again, this is something that artificial intelligence can't do. They can't deal with people who use anglicisms in English and who use anglicisms in French and who use Gallicisms in the other side in English. Whether or not there are dictionaries that can help with such words, I'm not aware of a dictionary that has a list of false friends. What I do know is that when I was preparing the admissions exam, I was looking up lists of false friends in English and French online, and there are many lists online with the most common false friends, like the ones I mentioned, like actually and actuellement, ignorer, to ignore, and also words that sound the same in the same language. So in our admissions process, we would ask people, what is the difference between ensure with an E and insure with an I? And that also allows us to know whether the person has that very in-depth knowledge of English, because we don't have time to look stuff up in dictionaries. We don't have time to ask ourselves, is ensure the one where you get insurance? Or is it the one where you make sure that something happens? We have to do that on the fly. So that's the kind of skills and capacity. So I'm very happy that you've raised that as a point, because it tells me that you are already aware that we very much deal with false friends and that kind of thing. So I'd very much encourage you to look up lists of false friends in French and in English, because we have to deal with them day in, day out, sometimes used well by our clients and sometimes used poorly. And so then we have to fix the damage they've done and then interpret that message correctly into the target language. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, perfect. Oh, I see you on the screen. Okay, I didn't know.
Yes,
okay, yes, it is you on my screen. Thank you. Okay, great. I'm glad I answered your question. Are there any other questions? And again, if anyone wants to ask a question in French, then go right ahead.
Можно сказать декілька слів? Je voudrais dire quelques mots. Nous vous remercions vivement de votre cours et de votre présentation, et c'est très intéressant pour nous et très utile pour nos étudiants. Merci à vous.
Ah bah, merci à vous pour vos remerciements. Ça a vraiment été un énorme plaisir pour moi d'être ici, de pouvoir présenter, et puis aussi maintenant de pouvoir présenter dans les 2 langues officielles du Canada. Donc ça fait plaisir d'entendre qu'il y a des étudiantes et des étudiants qui travaillent vers le français, puis depuis le français aussi. So I was just saying thank you again in French for having invited me to this event, for having first of all listened to me without dropping out. Without telling me to shut up or anything, and for the very interesting questions. Every question I've been asked, I've actually taken notes down, because I think it should be part of the initial presentation, because they've been great questions. So once again, a big thank you. If anyone has any other questions, now's the time. I see we've gone beyond 5 p.m. So
thank you. Thank you for your cooperation, Anton. Thank you very much. We are very glad to see you, and we have second part of our lecture. And good day, Jeanette.
Hello there.
Hello, and thank you very much. We are glad to see you. So I think that Anton, thank you very much one more time, and Jeanette, I think that we can start.
Okay. Perfect. So I'm going to sign off in that case. So once again, thank you ever so much, everyone, for listening in. I'll be sending my professional email address to Katerina. That way, if anyone has any questions about interpretation, do not hesitate. Send them through to me. I would be more than happy to answer them. So once again, thank you, Katerina. Thank you, Olga, for organizing this as well, for getting in touch and everything. And I wish you a great second part of this presentation and a great end of the day. Au revoir.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Right, so hello, Katerina, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. From what I understood from Olya, you wanted me to talk about employment in Britain and also the British recruitment industry. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and cover quite a lot. If anybody's got any questions, there will be time for questions at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do a short introduction about myself so that you know about my background. And then I'm going to talk about the UK recruitment market and go on to sort of talk about the size of it, how important it is, and then go on to employment in Britain. So how people find jobs in Britain, what people include on CVs, visas and language, problems that people encounter finding work, and then how technology is affecting the UK labour market and structural issues in the UK labour market. So to kick off, with regards to myself, I have been in recruitment since 1986, with the exception of 8 months. All of that time has been spent finding jobs for people in finance. And that has been right from purchase ledger clerks, sales ledger clerks, through to bookkeepers, accountants, and finance directors. I started my career in London. I then got married and moved up to Cambridge and set up my own recruitment company. It's a small local recruitment company, which most of the companies in Britain are, and I'll go on to talk about that. Alongside that, I also did about 6 years' work for the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. The Recruitment and Employment Confederation is our main trade association for the recruitment industry. And I lobbied for them. I was on the board for them for a year. I was also their employment policy committee chair for about 6 years and lobbied in Brussels on a very important piece of legislation called the Agency Workers Directive. It was basically that piece of legislation was trying to standardize temporary work, rules around temporary work across Europe, which was far harder than it sounds. Britain actually has the 3rd largest temporary marketplace in the world after America and Japan. So it's a very big part of our labour market. So the UK recruitment market, it's worth £42.9 billion to the UK economy in 2021. So I don't know if you know how much pound is worth in your, Olya told me it was 45.89 grivna, if I pronounced that correctly. So, yeah. So 42.9 billion is really a huge amount to be contributing to the economy. Of that, 36.4 billion is the temporary marketplace and the contract marketplace, and 6.5 billion are permanent placements. We're expecting further growth of about 7.5% this year in the recruitment marketplace. So in 2021, the industry made just short of 550,000 permanent placements. So we found 550,000 people work. We found 22.5 million people temporary or contract placements. The difference between temporary and contract in the UK is that temporary is when you work through the agency, and contract would be when we put you in a short-term job with a company and the company pays you rather than the agency. On average, the length of assignment for temporary workers is 15 weeks, and the length of assignment for contract workers is 22 weeks. But that does vary depending on the industry. So, for example, I deal with finance people, and a lot of my contracts will go on a lot longer than 22 weeks. It's not unusual for me to find people work for 6 months or 9 months on a contract. So at the start of 2021, there were 30,621 agencies in the UK. And of those, 79% are micro businesses, which means that they have less than 10 employees. 82% had a turnover of less than $1 million. And this is really important in the UK to understand the UK employment market. We're quite different from a lot of European countries. In a lot of European countries, you have 3 or 4 very big players, and they will dominate the marketplace. And they will send, their concept of a temp can be different as well, because in European countries, it's more like outsourcing. So they will be employed by the agency and sent out to companies for long-term assignments. In Britain, temporary assignments can be anything between 2 days, and I've had temps working for me for 2 years, but usually they're short-term. And because there are so many small agencies, micro agencies, and they tend to be local, they tend to be people like myself who worked for one of the big agencies and then decided that they wanted to work for themselves and set up their own agency. And we tend to be local. We create local links with local companies. Some of the companies I deal with, I've been working with for 30 years now. I probably know their companies better than the people actually in them at this moment, because I've dealt with them for so long. I know them, I know their culture. And that's really important when we're finding people for those companies, that we can look at the people that we're supplying and we match the people to the company. But the fact that we're very small, we're very local, and there's so many of us across Britain means that the market is very dynamic. It's very cutthroat, it's very, very competitive. If we find that we have a good worker that we can send out for a temporary role, we don't want to lose that worker. So if that temp finishes a job, we get on the phone or we send mail shots out and we work really hard to find that person a job. And I've actually found Ukrainians jobs actually that have come over to the UK in that way, because I've known people and phoned them and said, you know, I've got a Ukrainian here, their English is quite good, you know, they're looking for a job in finance, have you got anything? We do have larger firms, but they don't dominate the market. And there are, at the moment, there are over 201,000 people employed in the UK recruitment industry. So it's a very, very important way of finding a job if you ever come to the UK, and approaching agencies, talking to them, building up relationships with the people that are in the agencies and making them realise that you're a good worker and that if they send you out somewhere, you're going to do a good job for them. So coming on to employment in Britain generally, how people find jobs. I mentioned the temporary route as an important route into work. Obviously, people find permanent jobs, but the temporary market is really important for finding people jobs who are maybe coming to the country for the first time, or people who are from ethnic backgrounds, people who maybe have had illnesses and want to get back into the marketplace, people who have who are maybe mothers and trying to get back into work. It's a really important way of getting in. So if you ever come to Britain and want to do a job, if somebody offers you temporary work, don't turn it down. It's a way into a permanent job quite often. Obviously, people use job boards these days, and typical job boards that you would find jobs on in England are things like Reed is a big one, and obviously companies and agencies advertise on those job boards. What people include on CVs in Britain is possibly different from what you include on your CVs. One of the things that I have noticed when I've been recruiting Eastern Europeans is that quite often they put very glamorous photos of themselves on CVs, and they look absolutely stunning, actually. We don't do that in Britain. I don't know if it's because we don't think we look stunning, I don't know, but we don't put pictures on our CVs. We do tend to put hobbies on, which is something I haven't come across in other countries. I don't know why we put hobbies on, but I recently did a poll on LinkedIn and asked people whether they still do it, whether they still value seeing people's hobbies on a CV. And I was surprised that about 70% of people still said, yes, they do. So if you want to put your hobbies on, that's fine. I tend not to, I find them interesting, but that's nothing more than that. We have a lot of laws around discrimination in Britain. We're not allowed to discriminate on age, religion, gender, sexuality. Employers aren't allowed to ask you if you're planning on having children or how many children you have or what you're going to do about your childcare. All of that is illegal. So when you do a CV in England, you don't need to put your date of birth on. You don't need to put whether you're married on. So your name and your contact details will be fine. CVs should be skills-based. One of the changes really in CVs over recent years is making them accessible to computers. Computers read your CV. And so I always suggest to people that at the top of your CV, you should have a section for skills. Underneath skills, you should just have a lot of keywords that are relevant to your job search. So I don't know what kind of words would be relevant. Maybe, I think you're interpreters and translators, aren't you? So maybe, the languages that you have, I don't know what kind of things you would necessarily put down, simultaneous translation or, but all the key words that somebody might be able to find you under. That's really important because your CV is not just being read by people these days, it's being read by computers. And when I'm looking for somebody, I will put keywords into a search, and anybody that has those keywords on their CV will come up and I will then read it. If the keyword that I'm looking for isn't on your CV, you won't come up in my search and you won't have a chance of getting that job. So it's a really important part of your CV these days. Your CV should also be in bullet point format. There's a lot of psychology behind CVs, and people tend to think that the thing that you put at the top of your job, your first bullet point, is what you've done the most of. So if you read an advert, you need to go through the advert very carefully and think of it as an exam question. The advert is the question that you have to answer, and the answer is your CV. So if your CV is not in the right order to answer that advert, then you are not going to get that job. So you can move your bullet points around depending on the job that you are going for. And then visas and language. If you were coming to the UK, we have possibly 3 or 4 ways of coming to the UK at the moment. If you have relatives in the UK, then you can come to the UK via your relatives. There is a scheme for that. The main scheme at the moment is Homes for Ukraine. I hosted Olya when she first came over. I think we were some of the first using the Homes for Ukraine scheme, the Homes for Ukraine scheme. It drove me crazy. I mean, it was so bureaucratic. It was just untrue. I think it might have got a little bit easier for people. But basically, the Homes for Ukraine scheme, which you can find on the gov.uk website, is you have to find yourself somebody who will host you. I know it can be done through Facebook, because I have a friend who has a Ukrainian staying with him, and they met up through Facebook. But you have to somehow find yourself a host. And that host then has to put you up for 6 months. Quite a lot of the hosts in Britain are looking after people for longer than that. But it's difficult because obviously you're in somebody's home, and there have been situations where after 6 months people have said, we don't want people staying with us for any longer. We're finding this too much of a strain on us and our finances. You would then have to find another host, but once you were in England, the regional councils can help with that and have a duty to help with that. The other way maybe of getting to Britain is to study in the UK. If you study in the UK, you would have a visa for study that only allows you to work for, I think it's 16 hours a week. But if you study in the UK, you're then allowed to work for 2 years after that in the UK. In reality, on the finance side, and I don't know how it would apply to interpreting and things, but on the finance side, I found it quite difficult to get people work just for 2 years on a permanent basis. But I have found people work on a temporary basis. So you can stay for 2 years afterwards. The other way would be to come as a skilled worker, to get a company to sponsor you as a skilled worker. Again, that's quite hard because a lot of companies find it very expensive to do. And in reality, certainly on my side, on the finance side, again, I've done polls on LinkedIn with my followers there. People aren't very keen on doing it. I don't know how that would apply if you were an interpreter or translator at all. So you would have to make inquiries on that. Language can be an issue. I think if you're going to find work in the UK, you've got to have very good language abilities. I know that Olya has got very good English, but I think even then sometimes she's found it a little bit of a struggle. And I think and correct me, Olya, if I'm wrong on this, but I think one of the problems is that sometimes the British say things that they don't mean. And a simple example of this would be the use of the words quite or a bit. So for example, we might say, it's a bit cold outside, and what we actually mean is it's really freezing and snowing. So there's a lot of understatement in the British language that goes on. It's quite hot. It's incredibly hot. Or that was quite difficult. It was incredibly difficult. So it's not just hearing the language, it's also understanding what the British are saying behind that. And that can be incredibly difficult for somebody who isn't British born. Sometimes it's just down to the tone in which we say something. So we might say, well, yeah, that was all right. And a foreigner might think that we think it's all right, whereas actually what we're saying is, well, that was absolutely terrible. So it can be quite complicated to understand, I think, the British language. Technical words, if you have any technical words you need, if you're going to do an interview, then it's probably worth spending time with a dictionary and looking at those technical words and thinking about the kind of questions you might get asked in an interview and how you would answer them. The people I haven't been able to find work for are the people who haven't been able to explain what they actually do. Because if I can't understand what people do, then I can't sell them to the company. I can't sell their skills to the company. Also, try and work out, if you have qualifications, have a look at British qualifications, and if you can, see if you can match them up in any way. Obviously, some qualifications are international, but certainly, again, on my side, on the finance side, people have different qualifications in Europe than they do in the UK, but they can get UK people, UK organisations to say, well, that's the same as our qualification. And if you come to me saying that, or you go to an agency saying this is the equivalent of this, then that helps in terms of your job hunt. It also helps if you've got references, and preferably translated into English, because the English are absolutely terrible at foreign languages. So you really do need to have them translated if you can. So Finally, there's 2 points I'd like to talk about generally is how the technology is affecting the UK labour market and the pandemic. One of the things that people realised during the pandemic was that they could work from home. And since the pandemic has finished, there has been a tremendous battle going on between employers in the UK and employees in the UK, because employees don't really want to go back to working in the office. We're now at a point where we have hybrid employment, and that seems to be where it's settling down. Now, where hybrid employment is concerned, that would usually mean that you might work 3 days in the office and 2 days at home. It saves on petrol, because commuting in Britain can take quite a long time. We're a small island. We've got 70 million people living in Britain, and commuting, the roads are very, very crowded. So people quite like the fact that they can work from home and avoid all the stress of commuting. But it has been an ongoing battle. And even now, employers are trying to get people back into the offices, not always very successfully. And the final thing I'd like to talk about are the structural issues in the UK labour market. I don't think this is, I think Britain has its own issues around this, but I think that we're not the only people, the only country that has problems in their labour market at the moment. We have a huge shortage of people. That's due to 3 main things. Firstly, it's due to Brexit. We had an awful lot of Eastern Europeans come to Britain from the EU when they could in the 1990s and the early 2000s. I was quite surprised when we found Olya's daughter Mira, when we took her to the local school. There are 400 children in that school, and of those 400 children, 80 were Polish and another 20 were from Latvia and Lithuania. So a quarter of the school was from Eastern Europe. And we're not a very big town. So it kind of gives you an idea of the amount of immigration that Britain had from Eastern Europe. A lot of those people have gone home, but obviously there is still an awful lot in Britain. But a lot of those people have gone home, particularly the Poles, because Poland now is a relatively wealthy country to what it was in the 1990s. So that's one cause of the shortage of labour. We've also got the problem of long COVID, which I think most countries have, where people have had COVID but still not recovered from it. And that's taken quite a lot of people out of the labour market. But the main problem are people like me, actually, because I am the baby boomer generation. Now, the baby boomer generation was the post-war generation. I'm 61 now, and we're coming up for retirement or have already retired. The government is doing everything it can to encourage people of my age and above to stay in the labour market. But a lot of people have got the money not to work and don't see why they should. So it's a real issue because there aren't as many young people entering the labour market. There aren't any obvious answers to all of this. The British government, I think, thought immigration would be the answer to Britain's labour issues, but the Brexit vote kind of put a stop to that. I think the British felt that they had rather been swamped by immigration during the 1990s and the early 2000s, and people were finding it, and the services hadn't kept pace with that. So people couldn't get into the doctors, they couldn't get their children into schools. And a lot of that drove the Brexit vote, the Leave vote. And so the government is being really careful where immigration is concerned. It can't just open the doors and say, come in and fill our labour market. The interesting thing about the Ukrainians is I think that the British are putting them in a very separate box than the rest of the immigration that we've had. And they're being, I think Olya's probably finding this, she certainly said this to me, that she's finding that people are being very kind to the Ukrainians when they come to England. I think there's a lot of sympathy with what's going on in your country. And I think we'd like to make it, you know, as easy as we can for people that have had a very, very difficult time. So if you were to come to Britain, I think you would find that you would receive a warm welcome. And if you do come to Britain, then you, through the Homes for Ukraine scheme, for example, you would get all the benefits that we get, which are fairly substantial. So that's come in slightly shorter than when I practiced earlier. So I hope that's okay. But if anybody's got any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them.
Yes, Jeanette, I have some questions. And tell me, please, how many Ukrainians applied to your company, or maybe not one? So tell us, please, about it.
I've had a few, actually. So not many, but I've had a handful that have come to me and asked me to find them work. I haven't found all of them work, mainly because when there's a language issue, it's difficult. But I found one lady a job in the National Health Service, and that was a permanent job. So she's still there as far as I know. So, you know, that I would imagine, I'm very specialist. My agency is very specialist, so I just do finance. But I would imagine the general agencies like Reed or Manpower would be able to find more Ukrainians jobs than I can, because they do general work.
Oh, Jeanette, and it's very interesting for me. Tell me, please, what impressed you the most when you were working with Ukrainian CV?
Ukrainian CVs? Well, to be honest, I've actually helped Ukrainians put their CVs together for the UK marketplace. Mm-hmm. And that's something that a good recruiter can do for you. So it's not been a question of them coming to me necessarily with a CV. I've usually done an interview with them, and then I talked through the kind of things that they can do. I found out, and it's not been that easy, because I think the way you structure your firms is a little bit different. And so I've worked out the equivalent of what goes on in Britain. I've put it in the English language, and talked it through with them so that they can then talk about it at interview. You won't get that level of service with every recruiter, but some recruiters will help you like that. Mm-hmm. I think I've got some questions here.
So language is the problem for Ukrainians, yes, I think.
Sometimes, but sometimes not. I've had some Ukrainians that have spoken very good English, actually. You know, and we don't expect you to speak English like we do, obviously. You know, we will make allowances, and we're used to working with a lot of Eastern Europeans, where the English isn't perfect. The thing that you probably have going for you in a big way is that the British companies think the Eastern Europeans work hard. And I think, you know, I've had Poles working for me, and they do work a lot harder than the British. So, you know, it's seen very, very positively. You're seen in that light very positively, I think. And I know with Olya, I've been learning Russian with Olya for 2.5 years now, and sometimes she gives me homework, and I just think, how does she expect me to do all of this, you know? So, because and yet to her, that's a normal amount of work that she would give people. So I think the idea of work for the British and the idea of work for people whose countries aren't perhaps as well off is very different. So I've got here.
Yes, we got some questions.
Yes, what jobs are popular today in the UK? To be honest, at the moment, there are shortages right across the board. At anything you look at, there are shortages of people. There are particular shortages with scientists and engineers. But there are shortages on the farms picking fruit. There are shortages in the factories. So I don't question of what jobs are popular. I think it's a question of we need people to do those jobs. And what is the cost of living in the UK? I think it's a lot higher than it is in Ukraine. I think, but then the salaries are higher as well. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question in a way. I don't know if the person asking it, Olya's asked it actually. So what do you mean by that, Olya?
Yeah, sorry. I meant like if Ukrainians would travel to the UK in order to find a job, right? Maybe should they have some money for the first time, and what do they have to expect to spend like every month, like the minimum? Yes, like maybe the rent, the food. Yes,
it
like
depends where.
How expensive is it in the UK?
Yeah, it depends where you are. I would definitely bring money with you, and probably as much as you've got. It really depends where you live in the UK. I mean, you're in Huntingdon, which is East Anglia. For those of you that don't know the geography of the UK, East Anglia is sort of north of London. It's where Cambridge is, and it's a very expensive part of the country to live. So rents, for a small house, you're probably looking at £800 a month minimum. But if you were to look at the north, life is cheaper in the north. So effectively, the further north you go in England, the cheaper it gets. If you're in London, London is horrendously expensive. I mean, to give you an idea, back in 1989, and we're going back a bit, I was earning £45,000, which is, I lived in London, I was a single woman, I was earning £45,000. That's still a lot of money today. It was a huge amount back in 1989. I had my own flat, I had my own car, I had no money left at the end of the year at all. London just eats money up. So much as London is attractive to foreigners, personally, I would not recommend it as a place to go and live. If you're looking at rent there, I have a flat down in London, and the rent for that flat, it's a 2-bedroom flat, it's £1,300 a month. And that's probably at the bottom. It's right on the edge of London. It's not in an expensive part of London. So if you were looking at central London, the rents would just be, they're out of my reach. So, you've got to look at the different areas of England and the rents in different places in England. You've also got to look at the cost of food in the different places. It's cheaper, even petrol is cheaper in the north. I noted, because I'm originally from Manchester, which is in the northwest, and when I go home to my parents, I notice that petrol is quite a bit cheaper than it is in the south. So think quite carefully if you're coming to Britain as to where you want to be based. Obviously London, in theory, there's government jobs there if you're looking at interpreting and translating, but a lot of the government workers now aren't going into their offices, so they're working from a distance, from working from home, or WFH, as we put it. Does that answer the question? Yeah. And then I've got, and could you advise any websites where we can find examples of CVs? I'd have to think about that. The job boards don't normally do that. I can't think of anything at the moment, but I can have a look for you and see. Otherwise, if you just put in English CVs, templates, things might come up, but it's not something, and I'd be wary in a way of going on a template from the internet in some respects anyway, because I have seen CVs that are templates from the internet and they're not always great, I have to say. So just be careful on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your answering. Thank you for your lecture. Thank you for our cooperation. Thank you for your time. It's very important for us. It's very important to have opportunity to talk with you, to listen this information, and we thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed it, and
in Ukraine,
hopefully some of that will be of interest.
As we talk in Ukraine, красно дякуємо. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
We talk just not thank you, красно дякуємо. That's why we красно дякуємо вам. Ось всі ми. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Шановні учасники онлайн-лекторію, якщо ви ще бажаєте, хтось з вас хоче висловитись, то, будь ласка, ось ми подякували Жанет і зустрінемося з вами на нашій останній наступній зустрічі. Thank you, Jeanette. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Have a nice day. Goodbye.